In a world where trust is everything, Joyce Meyer, a beloved figure in Christian broadcasting, now finds herself at the center of an explosive scandal. Accusations of fraud and deception have surfaced, shaking the very foundation of her ministry. Could the woman who preached faith and prosperity be hiding a darker truth? The shocking revelations are unraveling, and the world is demanding answers. Prepare to uncover the truth that no one saw coming. The truth behind Joyce Meyer's empire will leave you speechless. Joyce Meyer's rise to prominence is a story that began in the most unlikely of places. Born into a family marked by pain and trauma, Joyce's early years were far from easy. She was sexually abused by her father for years, a trauma she kept buried deep inside for much of her life. The scars from that abuse ran deep, and for a long time, Joyce struggled to find peace. But despite this painful past, Joyce would find a way to turn her story into something much bigger than herself. For years, Joyce carried the weight of her abuse in silence. She didn't talk about it until much later, and it wasn't until she found faith that she truly began to heal. It wasn't an easy journey, and it didn't happen overnight. But over time, Joyce found strength in her relationship with God. She leaned into prayer, into the Bible, and slowly began to trust again, learning to forgive herself and others for the pain she'd endured. Her healing journey became a foundation, not just for her own life, but for the life she would eventually build helping others. Starting with small Bible studies at her local church, Joyce's approach was simple. There were no fancy stages or grand productions. It was just Joyce, folding chairs, Bibles, and her voice. And yet, it didn't take long for people to take notice. They didn't connect with her because she was perfect, but because she was real. She spoke openly about her struggles, her pain, and how God had helped her overcome. That honesty made people feel heard. It made them feel understood. Soon, word spread about Joyce's teachings. Her message resonated with others, and what started as a small group grew into something much bigger. Before long, Joyce was recording tapes, hosting radio shows, and even appearing on TV. Her ministry, Joyce Meyer Ministries, took off faster than anyone could have anticipated. She became known not just for her message of healing and empowerment, but for her relatability. People saw themselves in her, and that made her message all the more powerful. As her ministry grew, so did Joyce's reach. She began speaking at large conferences and arenas, drawing tens of thousands of people eager to hear her speak. Her books became bestsellers, and her TV broadcasts reached millions of homes around the world. Her message was one of hope and transformation, and it was clear that Joyce had tapped into something special. She became a household name in the Christian community, a beacon of faith and strength, especially for women who had experienced pain and trauma like she had. But even as Joyce's influence grew, she never lost sight of her roots. She remained committed to speaking to the brokenhearted, the wounded, and those who felt lost. Her own life story, filled with its share of heartache, became the foundation for her ministry, and she used it to encourage others to believe that, no matter how broken they were, they could heal and find hope through faith. Her rise to prominence was built on a simple but powerful message. Healing was possible, and anyone could find it with the help of God. And so, Joyce Meyer became more than just a preacher. She became a symbol of resilience and hope, a woman who turned her pain into a purpose that would touch millions. Joyce Meyer's message was simple but powerful. For years, she traveled the world preaching about faith, healing, and the power of trusting in God to meet all needs. She spoke to thousands of people, urging them to let go of material things and place their trust in God's ability to provide. Her words resonated with many, especially those who had struggled financially, emotionally, or spiritually. She became a symbol of hope for people who felt broken and lost, someone who could show them a way to rise above their circumstances. But over time, a strange and undeniable disconnect began to emerge. While Joyce Meyer was telling her followers to surrender to God and let go of worldly desires, her own life seemed to tell a completely different story. The contrast between her teachings and her personal lifestyle started to raise eyebrows. Joyce, a woman who spoke passionately about not needing material wealth to find peace, was living a life that looked anything but simple. As her ministry grew, so did her wealth, and the lavish lifestyle she led became increasingly difficult to ignore. Her ministry wasn't just about spreading the word of God, it was also about the lifestyle she had built. A lifestyle that seemed to contradict the very message she preached. Joyce lived in multi-million-dollar homes, some of them with several garages, swimming pools, and even elevators. These weren't just houses where she happened to live. They were huge estates, built with money that came from donations made by ordinary people, many of whom were struggling to make ends meet themselves. Her homes were not humble abodes. They were luxurious mansions that made it hard to reconcile the woman who had once preached simplicity with the woman now living in such excess. Then came the private jet. While many of her followers might have been saving up for their next vacation, Joyce was flying across the globe in a private Gulfstream jet owned by her ministry. Her explanation for the jet was that it helped her meet the demands of the ministry, flying to conferences and speaking engagements. But still, the jet was a symbol of something many couldn't ignore: luxury, comfort, and extravagance. It wasn't just that she was wealthy, it was the fact that she had a lifestyle that seemed to revolve around opulence, not simplicity. At first, people tried to brush it off, reasoning that maybe Joyce Meyer deserved the luxury. After all, she had worked hard, built a successful ministry, and helped millions of people around the world. But the longer her ministry thrived, the more it became clear that her wealth was being funded by donations from people who believed they were contributing to a good cause. Joyce's message of healing, empowerment, and prosperity came with a promise that if you give generously, God would bless you in return. People who were struggling financially, who were going through personal hardships, gave to her ministry in the hopes that they too would experience the blessings she promised. Some gave everything they had, believing that their financial sacrifice would lead to their own breakthroughs. But as more people started to ask questions, it became clear that the money given in faith wasn't always being used to help those in need or to spread the gospel. Instead, much of it seemed to be spent on lavish comforts, on Joyce's private jets, her luxury homes, and designer clothes. This wasn't just about the money, it was about the message. Joyce, who had once spoken so forcefully about the dangers of materialism, was living a life that seemed to completely contradict her teachings. How could someone tell people to give up their worldly desires and trust in God for their needs, while enjoying the very luxuries she had told them to avoid? The whispers started quietly at first. Rumors about the millions of dollars that Joyce Meyer Ministries was bringing in and how it was being spent. But over time, these whispers became louder. Investigations started. Journalists began looking into how the money was being used. Stories started to surface about extravagant purchases, about Joyce's personal wealth, and about how much of that wealth was being funded by the very people she was telling to give up their material desires. It wasn't just the luxury homes or the private jets that caused people to question her. It was the way she preached about giving. Joyce Meyer Ministries didn't just ask for donations. It asked for sacrificial donations. She told people that if they gave generously, God would bless them abundantly in return. Many of her sermons had a clear message: the more you give, the more you will receive. For some, this message seemed like a divine formula for success. The idea that giving to God would lead to personal prosperity resonated with many, especially those who were struggling financially. But the reality of how that money was being spent seemed to be at odds with her message. Joyce's lavish lifestyle was being funded by donations from people who believed they were contributing to the furthering of God's work. Many of her followers, desperate for hope, had given their last dollars only to see that money used to fund private jets and multi-million-dollar estates. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about trust. People trusted Joyce, they believed in her message of faith and hope, and when they started to see the disconnect between the message and the lifestyle, it caused a deep sense of betrayal. In 2007, the Senate launched an investigation into 6 major televangelists, including Joyce Meyer, to examine whether they were misusing tax-exempt donations for personal gain. Joyce, unlike some others, cooperated with the investigation. She released financial details, allowed her books to be audited, and promised to make changes. She even said that her salary would no longer come from donations, but from her book royalties and personal business ventures. When the book was published, to her credit, she complied with the investigation, which earned her some praise. However, the damage had already been done. The public's perception of her ministry had already shifted. Despite Joyce's cooperation, the investigation revealed that the ministry had indeed spent millions on luxury items, including expensive furniture, cars, and even homes. The contrast between what Joyce preached and how she lived was now impossible to ignore. She had taught her followers to trust God and let go of material possessions, but she was living a life of luxury, funded by the very people she had urged to give up their worldly desires. Some of her supporters defended her, arguing that Joyce had worked hard, had built a successful ministry, and deserved the fruits of her labor. But for many, the image of a wealthy preacher living in opulence while telling people to live simply was too much to ignore. The gap between the message and the reality became a focal point of criticism. Joyce Meyer's rise to prominence was built on a message of hope and healing. But the disconnect between her lavish lifestyle and her teachings left many questioning the authenticity of both her message and the integrity of her ministry. As the years passed, the controversy surrounding Joyce Meyer's lifestyle continued to swirl. Many people, especially those who had followed her for years, began to feel disillusioned. Some defended her, saying that she had done good work, that her ministry had helped millions, and that she deserved the luxury. Others, however, felt betrayed. They believed that they had given in good faith, hoping for blessings, only to discover that their contributions had helped fund a life of extravagance for someone who claimed to teach about humility and simplicity. The disconnect between Joyce Meyer's message and her lifestyle remained a defining issue throughout her career. No matter how much she tried to justify her wealth or explain her decisions, the questions kept coming. Was her message really about helping people, or was it just part of a carefully crafted brand? And more importantly, how could someone who preached about surrendering to God's will live such a lavish life while urging others to give sacrificially? The answer was never easy, and for many of Joyce Meyer's followers, it marked the beginning of the end of their trust in her ministry. What started as a message of healing and empowerment for millions soon became a story of materialism, luxury, and disillusionment. The very message that had inspired so many was now overshadowed by the image of a preacher who seemed to have everything she had once warned others against wanting. The gap between the life Joyce Meyer preached and the life she lived was a rift that would continue to haunt her legacy, leaving behind a complicated and often painful story. In the early 2000s, Joyce Meyer's rise to fame seemed unstoppable. She was preaching to millions, empowering people with messages of faith, healing, and prosperity. Her books topped bestseller lists, her TV broadcasts reached millions of homes, and her ministry grew into a global empire. She spoke about overcoming obstacles, finding peace, and trusting God to provide for every need. To many, she was the voice of hope, a beacon of light in a world full of hardship. But behind the scenes, a growing number of people began to question how all the wealth supporting Joyce Meyer Ministries was being used. As the ministry expanded, so did its expenses, and the extravagant lifestyle Joyce had come to enjoy started to raise eyebrows. The rumors started as whispers, but over time, they grew louder and more persistent. People began asking, was the money donated to the ministry really going to fund religious programs, missions, and charity work, or was it being funneled into a lavish lifestyle for Joyce Meyer and her inner circle? The questions were hard to ignore, especially when details began to surface about the ministry's spending. Joyce lived in multi-million-dollar homes with luxury furniture. A private jet was used for her personal travel, and rumors circulated about expensive personal items that were being bought using ministry funds. One of the most talked about purchases was a $30,000 zero-cent marble-topped vanity for Joyce's home, something that seemed a little out of place when compared to the message of humility and self-sacrifice she often preached. The contradictions between Joyce's lavish lifestyle and her message of simple living began to feel more glaring with every passing day. People began to feel uneasy about how much of their hard-earned money was being used to support this lifestyle. Many had donated to her ministry, trusting that their money was going toward helping others, feeding the hungry, building schools, or supporting global outreach programs. They believed in her message of hope and healing. But when they saw the luxury homes, the private jets, and the over-the-top spending, they began to question whether their donations were really being used for God's work, or if they were just helping fund Joyce's personal comforts. In 2007, the investigation that many had feared would eventually come to light started to gain momentum. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, known for his work on tax-exempt organizations, launched a probe into 6 major televangelists, including Joyce Meyer. The goal was simple: to determine whether these ministries were using their tax-exempt status appropriately or if they were abusing it to fund lavish lifestyle. Grassley and his team wanted to know if donations given in good faith were being misused. They wanted transparency. The investigation wasn't about theology or whether Joyce Meyer's teachings were right or wrong. It was about accountability and making sure the money was being spent wisely and ethically. The ministry was asked to hand over detailed financial records. Joyce, unlike some other televangelists who resisted the probe, agreed to cooperate. She opened her books, allowing the investigators to see the ministry's financial dealings. Joyce Meyer Ministries released some records, including details about her income, the ministry's expenses, and how the donations were being used. At first, this move was praised. It seemed like Joyce was willing to be transparent and to show that her ministry wasn't hiding anything. She even made some changes, such as announcing that her salary would no longer be drawn from donations, but instead would come from the profits of her books and personal ventures. For many, this seemed like a step in the right direction. However, even with her cooperation, the damage had already been done. The sheer scale of the ministry's wealth and the spending that accompanied it was a problem that couldn't easily be swept under the rug. The investigation revealed that Joyce Meyer Ministries had used a significant portion of the donations it received to fund luxury purchases. There were high-end homes, expensive cars, and even extravagant office furniture, all linked to the ministry. Critics pointed out that this seemed at odds with the message of humility and simplicity that Joyce had always preached. How could a ministry, especially one that asked for donations from ordinary people, justify spending so much on personal luxury? It wasn't just about the homes or the cars. It was about the private jet, a jet that the ministry had purchased and used for Joyce's personal travel. The justification for the jet was that it helped her meet the demands of her ministry, flying to different cities to speak at conferences and events. But the questions didn't stop there. People began to ask, why was it necessary for someone preaching about simplicity and trusting God to have a private jet when so many of her followers were struggling financially? By 2007, these questions became so loud that they led to a full Senate investigation. Senator Grassley and his team had started investigating 6 televangelists, Joyce Meyer being one of them. The ministry was forced to hand over a significant amount of financial information, and some of the details were truly shocking. The ministry had spent millions of dollars on things that most people would never consider ministry expenses. The public learned that Joyce Meyer and her family were living in luxurious estates, and the ministry's funds were being used to cover a lifestyle that was anything but modest. Joyce Meyer defended herself during the investigation, arguing that she had worked hard and that the money she had earned was her due. She said that the ministry had to support her travel and speaking engagements, which sometimes required a lot of time on the road and a private jet. She also claimed that her personal wealth was a result of her hard work, writing books, speaking at conferences, and building her brand. However, for many of her followers, this explanation didn't sit right. People had donated to Joyce Meyer Ministries because they believed it was going to help spread the word of God, not to fund private jets and multi-million-dollar homes. For the average person who had donated their last $100, 0 cents, in the hope that they might receive a blessing in return, it was hard to reconcile that with Joyce's extravagant purchases. The backlash from the public was swift and intense. Social media exploded with discussions about the investigation, and news outlets began running stories about the televangelist's wealth and the Senate probe. People began questioning the entire premise of prosperity gospel preaching, the idea that God would reward people with financial blessings if they gave generously. Joyce's ministry had promised that God would bless those who gave in faith, but the revelation of her own lavish lifestyle created a deep sense of betrayal among many of her followers. While Joyce Meyer herself tried to calm the growing criticism, it was clear that the damage had already been done. The investigation had opened a can of worms, and no matter how much Joyce tried to justify her actions, the image of a wealthy preacher living in luxury while preaching simplicity became impossible to ignore. The result was a deepening divide. Some of Joyce's followers continued to defend her, saying that she had earned her wealth through hard work and that her message of prosperity still held value. Others, however, felt betrayed and disillusioned. They had given money to her ministry in good faith, hoping for a spiritual reward, only to see that money being spent on luxuries. For them, the investigation was more than just a financial scandal. It was a spiritual one. It was a breach of trust. As the investigation continued and the public backlash grew, Joyce's image began to shift. She was no longer just a preacher and an author. She became a symbol of the corruption that many felt plagued modern televangelism. Her success had been built on the faith of millions. But as the details of her lavish lifestyle came to light, so did the questions about whether she had taken advantage of that faith for personal gain. The Senate investigation didn't result in any major legal consequences for Joyce Meyer, but it had a lasting impact on her reputation. While some people still defended her, others walked away, feeling betrayed by the preacher who had once inspired them with her message of faith, healing, and the promise of prosperity. The fallout from the investigation was a constant reminder that, in the world of televangelism, the line between faith and finance is often a blurry one.